New Orleans has been one of the world's favorite destination cities for a long time, thanks to more than 300 years of a rich and culturally diverse history. Its culinary traditions have earned a worldwide reputation for food that's sometimes different, but always delicious. When it comes to music, New Orleans invented its own, called jazz, now loved around the world. Even the way it says farewell to loved ones with music and dance spilling into the streets is iconic. But that's only one way New Orleans is different in how it buries loved ones. Its oldest and most historic cemeteries, even in their decline, are witnesses to a multicultural history and resting places to ancestors who contributed to that history. Some of us have reconnected to lost parts of their family histories right here at St. Louis Cemetery No. 2, a site representing over 2 centuries worth of buried history. This story begins for me right here inside the historic St. Louis No. 2 Cemetery after I inherited a tomb passed on by my grandmother to my parents. They made their own arrangements elsewhere. Unfortunately, I had not been at this tomb since 1985. That's when my grandmother, Jean Florence Veen, was buried here. Nor did we know much about the man she was named after, her father, John Veen, whose name is inscribed in marble above the vault erected for him in 1917. But that was only the beginning of my personal journey of discovery. Locating the tomb itself inside the 3 blocks that make up St. Louis No. 2 required an online visit first to the Historic New Orleans Collection's cemetery database. Howard Margot at the Historic New Orleans Collection explains the collaboration.
The 3 primary partners were THNOC, Tulane University, and Save Our Cemeteries. St. Louis 1 and 2 were the oldest and, in that sense, the most endangered of these historic cemeteries. The survey that was done in the 80s preserved some information that's not there anymore. Right now, we have the data and the photographs for St. Louis 1 and all 3 squares of St. Louis 2. But there are 6, 7 more cemeteries that have to undergo that same process. It's both a tool for genealogists, people simply looking for family names and ancestors. That's a really easy way to find them if they're in the database. And it's also a tool for preservationists.
Using basic online tools and with help from local genealogist Jarry Honoré, I learned that my great-grandfather had been the 5th offspring of a union between a French émigré and a slave girl nicknamed Aggie.
In the New Orleans of the 1840s, immigrants are pouring into the city from Ireland, from Germany, from France. One of those foreign French, les Français étrangers as they call them, was Jean Veen. He's a wood and coal merchant, and in 1854 he acquires Agathe, and at that point there are 2 children, Léon and Marie. So here we have an enslaved woman who is a domestic. She's a cook, a very skilled cook, forming a relationship with this French immigrant and ultimately securing her freedom as a result of that relationship.
The Frenchman's 1864 will reaffirmed that he had freed Agathe and their 4 living children, plus the unborn child, my great-grandfather, who'd be born 4 months later and named Jean. Within a month, at a court-ordered estate sale, Agathe purchases all of Jean-André's assets with cash. 6 years later, census data for 1870 shows her still running the wood and coal business while living with their 5 children. We knew little about any of that history beyond my grandmother's father, Jean, having been a musician who died when she was very young. Turns out, great-grandfather, better known by his stage name, Ratty John Veen, was one of the city's original trap set drummers and apparently quite a character, according to music legend Danny Barker, who related hearing about him as a child.
Ratty John Veen was the boss of the drummers downtown. Ratty John Veen had a mustache, but he was the boss drummer. Everybody respected John Veen. They call him Ratty, not R-A-T-T-Y. There's two words you got there. Then the R-A-D-D-Y, Ratty.
Digging further, I learned that my great-grandfather, the drummer, also worked at the family's wood and coal business, even maintaining a warehouse in the infamous Storyville district where fellow musicians could rehearse. His oldest brother, Leon Andre, a drayman, delivered merchandise around the city. Turns out that Leon Veen also belonged to Economy Hall, a society of successful black men in New Orleans committed to the advancement of their people. Award-winning author Fatima Sheikh's pivotal work, Economy Hall, documents their inspiring history starting in 1836.
They were rooted in New Orleans at least 2 generations by the time they started the Economy Hall. They had education. Many of them had wealth that they had either brought from Haiti or they had gotten inherited wealth. Some of them had freed themselves or had their parents free them. So they were people who had become free men of color by 1836 through many different means. The Hall had a library. We didn't have libraries. We're most of the blacks in New Orleans, are about half, the half that were enslaved, to 55% that were enslaved, were banned from reading and writing. So for the society to establish a library in 1836 meant that their people, their men, could come in there and sit there and read. What you started seeing creep into the American consciousness around the 1850s, and this had to do a lot with the Civil War, was an idea of white supremacy. In fact, there was a slave owner's manual that I used as a source, and it said that the color of the slave is the badge of his servitude and does well to make him believe it is so. So, I mean, that just like hit me like a ton of bricks, because not only were they saying that this was going to be the marker for keeping people enslaved or as servants, but did well to make them believe it. These people did not feel they were inferior to anybody, and they did not buy it. They just did not buy that what was being put out there, that black people were unequal in some way. So they knew they had education, they knew they had wealth, they had land. They did anything anybody else could do, except for these restrictions, these legal restrictions on them. So when people would say, well, you are inferior, it didn't even cross their mind that of course not. African blood has nothing to do with your equality.
Those same Economy Hall records include a passage noting the death and burial of my great-great-uncle Leon in 1905. 7 years before his mother, the former slave Agatha, who lived on until 1912. Both are buried here at Leon's family tomb inside Square 3 of St. Louis Cemetery No. 2. By the turn of the century, the extended Veen family lived at this home in the 900 block of Bienville. Other family members living there included Leon's daughter, Leontine Veen, the first black female teacher ever hired by the Orleans Parish School Board, assigned to the famous colored waifs home where she taught the great Louis Armstrong. Leontine was its head mistress, but we were unable to confirm her identity in this group photo taken during that period. We also located this vintage local ad inside the annual Woods Directory, printed to promote businesses of color for La Coralie, a business offering ladies' fitted corsets sold by Cora Veen Wilson from that same family address on Bienville. So here's the home on Bienville Street where 3 generations of my Veen family ancestors lived, including the former slave Agathe, her firstborn son Leon, Leon's daughter Leontine, the school teacher, and a granddaughter, Cora, who operated her ladies' corset shop from this same location. Unfortunately, like so many New Orleans families with such memories that have withered, nobody passed on those stories to any of us. Even though some of the resources needed for family research are easier to access than one might imagine. At the Orleans Civil District Court's Notarial Archives Research Center, citizens can always access historical records dating back more than 3 centuries. We visited the Research Center as Clerk of Court Chelsea Richard Napoleon kicked off a month-long series of October activities to educate citizens on how to utilize those records as another invaluable tool for family history, property, even architectural and landscaping research. The St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 was formally consecrated in August of 1823, 34 years after the first St. Louis Cemetery was established under Spanish rule in 1789. Both sites fulfilled the young city's need to accommodate burials outside of the French Quarter. The old St. Peter Cemetery property had been decommissioned to allow for more commercial development inside the quarter. Custody of both new cemeteries was entrusted to the Cathedral Deanery, but space was designated for non-Catholics too. Both sites also allowed burials of New Orleans free blacks who were usually Catholic and who already made up a sizable part of its population long before any Emancipation Proclamation. A walk through St. Louis No. 2's 3 sprawling squares reveals its rows of distinctive wall vaults, making up 11 of its total 12 exterior brick walls. Then there's rows and rows of iconic above-ground tombs reflecting various cultures and architectural influences fascinating to our visitors.
New Orleans, South Louisiana, did not invent above-ground tombs. They existed in Europe before they were built here, but they sort of became a trademark here because once that style was established, people just realized it didn't make sense to dig graves anymore.
Besides those rows of family tombs giving cause to the description cities of the dead, another fascinating architectural attraction are the once majestic and historically significant society tombs dotting the landscape like skyscrapers.
For individuals who did not have their own family burial site, they were buried together in a society tomb.
The reason that many people joined these benevolent type societies was that they wanted burial insurance, they wanted health insurance. If anything would happen to them, the society would give money to the widow and the family, and the society would bury this person.
On a hopeful note, Catholic Cemeteries has announced a campaign that would, in its words, raise critical funding to jumpstart the full restoration of 10 select society tombs within the St. Louis No. 2 Cemetery through an apprentice trades partnership. That partnership with the New Orleans Master Crafts Guild would recruit paid apprentices from the local community to learn the highly sought-after career skills of masonry and plastering while helping Master Guild craftsmen to repair and reconstruct those landmark but long-neglected society tombs. Those tombs are now crumbling at an alarming rate, just like this one in Square 3 that required emergency repairs. St. Louis No. 2 remains an active cemetery where burials still take place despite the deteriorating conditions inside. This service was for a member of the Sisters of the Holy Family, all of whom are buried here, along with their foundress, Mother Henriette DeLille. Mother DeLille is the young free woman of color who in 1836 founded the Sisters of the Holy Family. Now she's a candidate for sainthood. All of the sisters are buried in multiple tombs right here at Square 3. Some families still maintain long-time traditions like visiting their ancestors' tombs on All Saints' Day. Some still maintain and touch up those tombs themselves to prevent further decline.
Everybody would be out there painting the tombs, freshening them up, put fresh flowers for All Saints, All Souls Day. And it was a nice social occasion.
These photos depict what my great-grandfather's tomb looked like in late 2021 when I began this journey. It had been over 25 years since the tomb had been used, but despite deterioration, it was still structurally sound. Ultimately, I decided to restore the tomb despite the presence of many more deteriorated and abandoned tombs nearby. These scenes were taken as a second coat of paint was being applied to complete the restoration. Also, we decided to opt for perpetual care at that site. Capital improvement needs across this cemetery are tremendous, and Catholic Cemeteries maintains a donor-funded abandoned tomb initiative to restore some of those individual abandoned structures. We were allowed to document this abandoned tomb restoration from start to finish, as it was stripped of its original exterior mortar, then repaired using traditional plastering techniques before being fully restored over a span of several weeks. Sadly, a great many family tombs at this historic site have no more descendants to reclaim ownership or the resources to restore them like some of us have elected to do. Born and raised in California, Lynette Lynn Dostie knew her Louisiana ancestors had come from the St. Francisville area and from New Orleans, a place that she had visited only once. Like many other families, they moved to California seeking better opportunities in a less virulent racial climate. Lynn's father knew that his grandparents had been les gens de couleur libre, that is to say, free people of color, and that they were Catholic. Also, that they were buried in New Orleans. But life changed after inheriting a trove of early photo cabinet cards and other documents providing clues and confirmation about her NOLA ancestors, including them being interred at St. Louis Cemetery No. 2.
In this tomb, we have my first, second, and third great-grandmother, and my third and fifth great-grandfathers.
Lynn Dostie began doing her own basic family research online using organizations and resources available to all, including the Louisiana Creole Research Association and the New Orleans Public Library, where she met us to share some of her own journey of discovery.
Those photos, when they returned to me 3 years ago, I said, it's time to put a story to these photographs, to discover who they were, and that brought me to New Orleans. So I knew my great-grandmother was Hortensia Pierre Mitchell, and I could still hear my grandmother say her name. And I knew she was a seamstress, and she worked at Haspel Brothers. It was not just a working relationship, it was also a business relationship. So she had a long history with Haspel Brothers. And she chose to stay in New Orleans when her daughter moved to California.
The New Orleans Public Library's Louisiana Division City Archives provides resources and services for people like Lynn Dostie reconnecting with family history. Archivist Greg Osborne is also a genealogist who recommends resources within everyone's reach.
The obituary is a great place to start with your research, and very easy, because they provide so much information. They give not only your year of birth, your date of death, your parents, your siblings, your spouse, your children, your grandchildren, your nickname, where the funeral will take place, and where you're buried. And so many people are looking for where their ancestors are buried.
My father has been searching for that grave site since 1962. He is now 80 years old, ill, and not able to take that heritage tour. And we just found the tomb this year.
Lynn Dostie was still pursuing her ancestral history with a passion when we touched base in the fall of 2023, compiling boxes of folders stuffed with more birth and more marriage records, including cemetery records wherever available. For Lynn, it's become a sacred duty.
It's important for us to keep their legacy alive.
Imagine growing up in Minnesota, knowing your family had moved from NOLA during your childhood, but really knowing very little else. For historian and author Mark Rudinet, only after his father's death did he make a profound discovery, not only about his ancestors' role in New Orleans history, but also about his own Creole identity that his parents left behind in New Orleans.
I was born in this city in 1951. My family eventually moved north to Chicago. My father passed away in 2005, and while I was going through his papers, I discovered an oddly unlabeled binder. And I opened it up, and the first picture I saw was a black man named Louis Charles Roudenay. This man was his great-grandfather, and that he was the founder of the South's first black newspaper, Le Union, and the founder of America's first black daily, the New Orleans Tribune. Now understand that I grew up in Jim Crow New Orleans, raised and steeped in whiteness. And when this came to me, when this gift came to me, I cannot find words to describe the emotions that were swirling around me. I felt proud, of course. I felt excited. I felt angry immediately at a kept secret. Why was this kept from me? I knew in my bones why it was kept from me, all right? My father did everything he could to walk away from so much as one drop of blackness in his DNA. It completely, in a moment, changed me. I was no longer who I thought I was. I was something else. I wasn't sure at the time, but I knew that I had been struck by lightning, and I was in a state of shock. And I find out that my great-great-grandfather was a medical doctor here in the city. He was educated at the Faculty of Medicine of Paris, the finest, most advanced medical school in the world. And while he was there, he participated in the 1848 revolution, a revolution that witnessed the end of all slavery in France and French colonies by law. A revolution that created equality regardless of your skin color. He participated in that revolution. He comes back to Louisiana in 1856 with a liberation mindset. Free people of color had a degree of autonomy and wealth and education when he left. When he came back, the city had become Americanized. There was no longer this social construct of enslaved, white, and free people of color. All of a sudden, the Americans wanted binary. You're either black or you're white. That's what he came back to. And when he came back, soon thereafter, the Union Army liberated the city in May of 1862. And he, along with his brother, John Baptiste Roudenay, Paul Trevine, and other members of the free colored community got together, and in their words, in the words of Arnold Burtnow, we opened our hearts to hope. Things were going to change, and they had that hope. That's why he started the newspaper.
Mark Roudenay located the tomb of his great-grandfather, the founder of the New Orleans Tribune newspaper, Dr. Louis Charles Roudenay, inside St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, where his parents actually photographed him as a child before leaving New Orleans behind. He then located two more tombs of his ancestors inside St. Louis Cemetery No. 2. Like others with ancestral tombs there, Roudenay worries that most New Orleanians don't even realize how many of this city's earliest black achievers and history makers of all backgrounds are buried at the historic site.
Warren, here lies Marie Couvent, born enslaved in West Africa, held captive, put on a ship, and sent to Saint-Domingue. Eventually, she ends up after the revolution in Louisiana, okay? She becomes quite entrepreneurial, and along with her husband, accumulates a great deal of wealth. Before her death, she writes a will, and she stipulates that any money that's left, which was considerable, would go to the establishment of the Catholic home for indigent colored orphans. That's exactly what happened.
Here in square number 3 of St. Louis number 2 Cemetery, the history makers and culture bearers are literally all around us. This is the tomb of Oscar J. Dunn. He was Louisiana's first elected black lieutenant governor, and according to all the newspaper accounts, when he died, his funeral procession was followed by thousands of mourners.
In 1980, the NAACP commissioned just a brief little pamphlet on St. Louis Cemetery number 2, Square 3. And in that pamphlet, Joe Logsdon, the late professor at UNO, he said that St. Louis number 2, Square 3 was the most significant collection of memorials to African Americans in the world. So many of the sites that were integral to our history are gone.
The gates here at St. Louis Cemetery number 2 have been closed to public visitors ever since the COVID pandemic. Exterior signage that used to identify the cemetery and how to contact the Catholic Cemetery's office was removed by 2023. Family descendants can still obtain a visitor's pass, but many New Orleans families have allowed the knowledge of their ancestors or even where they're buried to be lost to successive generations. Besides launching an initiative to repair some of the crumbling society tombs, Catholic Cemeteries advised us in late 2023 there were no other discussions underway to do further repairs. In addition, no plans underway to reopen the site to any public visitors in the foreseeable future, even on a limited basis. Meanwhile, all of their other cemeteries, with the exception of St. Louis number 1, remain open to visitors free of charge.
It doesn't matter whether we have individual family tombs in St. Louis Cemetery or not. That heritage belongs to all of us.
That story is important to all Americans. It's American history. It's black history, but it's American history.
Most people don't read history with emotion. They read it with dispassion, right? But it's emotion that makes people remember things.
Visitors to New Orleans can only hope that someday these locked gates at St. Louis number 2 will finally be reopened so the rest of the world can marvel at these memorials to so many New Orleans history makers and culture bearers. And unless more of us come to their aid, the crumbling bricks of these historic resting places at St. Louis Cemetery number 2 will continue to crumble away. Victims of time, victims of the elements, and victims of our neglect. Hopefully, too, the souls and the history buried at St. Louis Cemetery number 2 will someday enjoy their well-deserved recognition and respect.
So if you think you have the time, you don't. It is up to us, those who are alive and available, to reclaim our history and to keep their legacy alive. It's very important. And in doing so, you not only discover about them, you'll discover who you are.